This session is being recorded. So it's my pleasure and delight to welcome you to this event that's being sponsored, and somewhere there's some background noise coming through. So yeah, let's be sure that everyone is muted. Great. Okay. So just wanted to welcome you to this event that is being sponsored by Drew University and Manhattan College. My name is Donald Proby. I will be your moderator today. And this is a session on anti-Islamophobia now. Why this and what can we do? Peace in the Middle East is the overarching umbrella, and peace across the globe are the key issues that we are concerned with in our gathering today. We will be doing that from multiple lenses, and we have two amazing speakers here that will introduce themselves in just a little bit to broker this dialogue together. Also, just drawing our awareness to the fact that there are 32 wars on the planet at this time, in addition to climate change, which I see as a war against the planet itself. That's really sobering when we think about just the global impact of violence on our families, on our children, on our communities. But today, and our time together, is about connection. It's about relationships in the past, present, and future. It's about ancestral gratitude, and in this moment, inviting you to take just a moment to think about ancestors that have influenced your lives, ancestors that have done the arduous work to bring us to where we are today, with work that is unfinished and work that has also been healing. And in that spirit, we come together to continue that work in healing. We invite that presence. We invite you to ancestors that are living, that are here with us today, as well as those that are deceased. We also invite you to take a moment to consider the land that you are sitting on, the land that you are standing on. I am coming to you from Santa Fe County, a land that historically has been stewarded in good faith by the Pueblo people. Our two speakers will take just a few moments or so to introduce themselves, Dr. Afridi as well as Dr. Golden. And we'll start with Dr. Afridi.
Thank you so much to Drew, and especially my colleague, Jonathan Golden, who I worked with for years on and off. And we did something similar like this. I don't know how many years ago, Jonathan, but about maybe 6, 7 years ago. So this is work that I've been doing pretty much all my life, which is on anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. I am the director of the Holocaust, Genocide, and Interfaith Education Center at Manhattan College. I'm also professor of Holocaust and Islam. So as you can imagine, this has been a very challenging time and an explosive time for someone like me who is Muslim and has fought against anti-Semitism, but also Islamophobia, being someone who's experienced Islamophobia throughout my time in the United States and elsewhere. So I just want to say thank you, and I hope we can have a good conversation and dialogue and add some meaning and give you some strategies in terms of how we can think about what's going on today and how we can navigate our world in terms of peacemaking.
Thank you. Mehnaz, I'm Jonathan Golden. I direct the Center on Religion, Culture, and Conflict at Drew University, where I've been teaching for almost 25 years now. And indeed, a special thanks to Donald, who I've worked very closely with the last few years, and now teaches in our conflict resolution program at Drew, among other things. And yes, my colleague, Dr. Afridi, who, as she told you, we've done a lot of work, this type of work together over the years. You know, directing the center is an interfaith peace institute, and I really see this as a sacred duty and great responsibility. You know, our mission is to educate the next generation of leaders in interfaith and intercultural understanding, And this is obviously now are the times where, you know, you really need to step up more than ever. Something I'll just add too that I don't always, it's not necessarily a critical piece of my introduction always in every one of these academic venues, but I am Jewish and I'm an observant Jew. I observe the Shabbat and keep kosher. And I have always, I actually directed the Hillel at Drew University for some years, a few years ago. And so, I have always stood up to and called out anti-Semitism, no matter when and where I've encountered it, no matter who the source. I've also tried my hardest to always stand up to any form of hatred, prejudice, be it anti-Black, anti-LGBTQ, anti-Asian, and so forth. And of course, Islamophobia at the fore of that, where, mostly what I will be talking about today. And so again, it's just really important that everyone here really grasps what we are trying to do. We didn't advertise the event that way, but you'll learn in just one moment that, if you intuitively thought that I was going to speak predominantly about anti-Semitism and Mehnaz about Islamophobia, we actually have that backwards. We felt it was very important to model this type of empathy, compassion, honesty, authenticity, and just a commitment to the principle of being against hatred, no matter where and how, it manifests itself. And as a matter of fact, I would say more than anything, as a Jew, I feel it is absolutely my responsibility to stand up for Muslims and to stand up for, anybody else that is experiencing any form of hatred. So thank you so much. I'm so glad you're all here. So many of you. This is wonderful. So I'm going to turn it back to Mehnaz. Or am I turning it back to Donald? Sorry.
Back to Donald. Thanks,
Okay.
Dr. Golden. And before we go any further, I also would like for Henry and for Esther just to wave a hand and give a shout out. We're delighted to have them with us today, both from Drew University, helping us with tech. And just to set a little bit of context and framework for the dialogue, that we are inviting a collectivist energy and the spirit of Ubuntu. That is in the spirit of understanding at a deep level that I am because we are, and remembering that we belong to each other. Also an invitation to move away from positionality of it's got to be this way, it's got to be that way, the either or thinking that is fueling so much of the difficulty between colleagues, between families, and between community members. And in this space, we want to elevate the humanity. Our speakers will explore shared perspectives across differences. They will speak with consideration that is outside of their own individual experiences at times. However, they do not speak for anyone or for any particular people. And this is all in the spirit of empathy and peace building. Dr. Afridi.
Thank you, Donald, for setting up the space. I'm going to do pretty much what Dr. Golden said in terms of talking a little bit about anti-Semitism in the United States. I want to make very clear that we're talking about what's going on here in this country and how it has polarized not just Jews and Muslims, but really Americans, which was already polarized politically. So I want to share, these are just talking points that I'll go through as quickly as I can, because I don't want to take too much time in, let me see. So Islamophobia and anti-Semitism, why this and what can we do? So I started thinking about the history of anti-Semitism in terms of Jews and how racism against Jews is not new. It is not something that began with 1948. It is the longest standing hatred. I teach anti-Semitism all the time in my classes. And even in the United States, we find that in 1654, the first group of openly Jewish settlers arrived in New Amsterdam, which is New York. I give them a lot of examples of the Lower East Side as being one of my favorite places where Jews were, and created things like the food cart. Anzia Yedzersky has this wonderful collection of books about living in New York that was translated from Yiddish. And then in the 1920s, we have all of a sudden this notion that Jews are non-white. They are seen as racialized, just like they were solely seen as other and non-whites in Nazi Germany. We had KKK speakers, publications described Jews as unwilling to racially and culturally assimilate to an essentially white and Protestant America. Jews cannot assimilate was the message. Jews are seen as communists was the message, and Jews are not white. In 1920, the KKK propagates the white genocide conspiracy theory, which claims there is an international and Jewish-led effort to promote mass immigration, intermarriage, and abortion, among other things, to lead to the extinction of whites. So again, you have this message that Jews are unwilling to racially and culturally assimilate to essentially white Protestant America. And it's important for us to historically contextualize at this moment. We have also convinced that Jews bore the responsibility for First World War. Car maker Henry Ford sold 10 million copies of his book, The International Jew, The World's Foremost Problem, beginning in 1920. You can still buy the book on Amazon. Eugenics in the United States, the movement was embraced in the 1910s and 20s. Most supporters in those places endorsed Objectives American advocate Charles Davenport. I think that this is an extremely important part of history that, I mean, even my students are dazzled by, because it really was a science devoted to the improvement of the human race through better breeding. And therefore you have things like race and blood as aiming against Jews, Black Americans, and homosexuals. Its supporters lobbied for positive eugenic efforts. So if we breed the right people with each other, then we will have a better race. And that was basically what eugenics was about. There are some fantastic historical books on this, as well as amazing documentaries that were based on Sven Lindqvist's book called Kill Those Brutes. Anti-Semitism, a big word and a big problematic word, because there are many, 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 many discussions about what it is and what it's not. So by the 1920s, in America, the idea that Jews represented a separate foreign race that threatened the US had become prevalent among the Protestant majority. The KKK in that decade focused on anti-Semitism just as strongly as anti-Catholic nativism and anti-Black racism. KKK speakers and publications described Jews as unwilling to racially and culturally assimilate. Semites are also referred to as Arabs. I know people ask me this question all the time. This was a linguistic term used for Jews and Arabs. The word derived, however, from an 18th century analysis of languages that differentiated between those with so-called Aryan roots and those with so-called Semitic ones. Within this framework, why we call anti-Semitism particularly Jewish is because of this. Jews became Semites, and that designation paved the way for Marr's new vocabulary. This is Wilhelm Marr. He could have used the conventional German term Judenhass, Jew hatred, to refer to his hatred of Jews. But that way of speaking carried religious connotations that Marr wanted to de-emphasize in favor of racial ones. Apparently more scientific, Marr's anti-Semitism caught on. Eventually, it became a way of speaking about all forms of hostility toward Jews throughout history. So I also use this term because it has so much historical valence for me. Eugenics was something that was transported to Nazi Germany in terms of racial hygiene. You had the beginnings of mappings. This is a map from 1935, where Nazi posters talked about feeble-mindedness was passed down, alcoholism was passed down, and this poster was also part of the racial Nazi theory. which also were, eugenics also influenced the Nuremberg laws in terms of Germany and looking at different people with races and blood. Henry Ford has to be mentioned again because he really was somebody who dissented into anti-Semitism. He was celebrated by us here in America, still is, convinced that bankers and Jews were responsible for a whole range of things he didn't like. From the World War to short skirts to jazz music, Ford used his newspaper, the Dearborn Independent, to carry on an active anti-Semitic campaign. And between 1920 and 22, a series of articles denounced all things Jewish, while officially apologizing for the articles in 1927. Ford's anti-Jewish sentiments ran deep. You had also, during the passage of Jews that were trying to escape from Nazi Germany, we also refused to admit, the Cuban government refused to admit 908 passengers, and we sent them back to death camps. Not all of them were killed, but most of them were killed. Although the American people and their government had a lot of information about the Nazi persecution and later murder of Jews, the rescue of Jews never became a national priority. The United States alone could not have prevented the Holocaust. We know that. But more could have been done to save some of the 6 million Jews who were murdered. As you know, I teach the Holocaust, and every time I'm horrified how many people did not do anything to rescue Jews or intervene. And then we go to all the way up in terms of anti-Jewish, anti-Muslim, and Jewish control on Muslim immigrants. And this comes really to the recent sort of attacks we've had against Jews and Muslims both. Robert Bowers in 2018, the alleged gunman who reportedly shouted, "All Jews must die," before opening fire in a Pittsburgh synagogue at the Tree of Life Synagogue, appears to have regularly posted anti-Semitic conspiracy theories on the extremist social media site, including accusing Jewish people of trying to bring evil Muslims into the United States. I think Jonathan can probably say more about that. Then, of course, in 2017, we had white nationalists encircle counter-protesters at the base of a statue of Thomas Jefferson after marching through the University of Virginia campus with torches on August 11th. And that was horrifying because we think of the kind of march that took place then really was reminiscent of the KKK, which I showed you earlier. So I'm making historical connections here. Eric Ward, a good friend of mine, I'm hoping he's joining this. I'm using his quote here: "The white nationalist movement that evolved from the 1920s became the 1970s. And look at that jump of time. A revolutionary movement that saw itself as a vanguard of a new whites-only state. This latter movement, then and now, positions Jews as the absolute other, the driving force of white dispossession, which means the other channels of its hatred cannot be intercepted without directly taking on anti-Semitism. White nationalist anti-Semitism must not be dismissed. At the bedrock of the movement is an explicit claim that Jews are a race of their own, and that their ostensible position as white folks in the US represents the greatest trick the devil ever played." January 6, 2021, we see the famous Camp Auschwitz sweatshirt, Confederate flags, the sort of like taking over of our government, but again, you know, with anti-Semitic hopes and slogans that appear to be, for me, very dangerous. 2023, how and why are these protests anti-Semitic? So we see protests today that are deemed as being anti-Semitic. We see others that are talking about anti-Muslim protests. We see Nazi symbols and posters that are equated with the Jewish star. We see anti-Zionism signs. What do they mean to Jews? I'm happy to talk about that, and attacks on campus, which of course concerns me and Jonathan a lot because we are professors. We teach at colleges that we really care about. And Cornell University, Columbia University, UC Berkeley, City University of New York, Harvard University, and some other major universities have been have had a lot of problems and issues, attacks on Jews on campus, attacks on Muslims, the questions of freedom of speech, the question of also from river to sea, posters, annihilation of Israel, ? Or a slogan of strength, ? These are questions that people have sincerely about what's going on. And I don't know why we don't have a national conversation about this, which could be more educational in terms of what it is that Jews feel when you have these slogans, and what do Muslims feel when you have other slogans that appear in front of them, like terrorist and Hamas and Palestinian all equated into one. Usage of this phrase has an effect that is really problematic, and it's Jews feel very unsafe and ostracized because for them, from the river to the sea is annihilation of Israel. And so I think one of the things that we haven't understood about Jews, and this was a conversation during Black Lives Matter, was, you know, how Jews still, if they are quote unquote passing white, are still ostracized because of being Jewish. And I think that's really deeply problematic in terms of understanding the history of the United States, the history of our campuses, and the history of different political movements in this country that are ongoing today. I think that is, oh, okay, what can you, oh, here. Zionism, colonialism, and fascism are all kind of parcel of a lot of the protests. Again, you can see why that is so hurtful. That can be painful for people who do support Israel, which is Zion for most Jews. Some Jews don't support Zionism, but they are Jewish. And some people do feel that Israel is colonizing. This is from a Jewish perspective, and these are different perspectives from Jews. It's not a perspective from a Muslim, as me, but from how Jews define themselves is very differently and very diverse in terms of how they think of this. However, when you have a poster like this with Zionism is fascism, and colonizers out of DC, you're basically telling Jews that they're fascists and colonizers, and they do not belong in our capital. What can you do? I hope we can talk about this more. There's a lot you can do. There's a lot of really good things in the United States that we forget. I just came back from Europe. I was in Zagreb, and I work a lot with Western European countries. And I have to say that we're really blessed to have religious freedom in this country. It is really a gift that I don't think people really allow themselves to sort of understand and grasp and take advantage of. There are interfaith initiatives all over the country. You need to join one. And there are Jewish-Muslim conversations that are ongoing even during this tumultuous time. The Sisterhood of Salam Shalom, Muslim Jewish Advisory Council of HAC, ADL and I have done programs together on my campus on community building. There are just amazing interfaith initiatives that are willing to be not just in a safe place, but a brave space. And that's what we need right now, is to be in a brave space. Dialogue and listening, there are good examples of that. Dartmouth College, and I'm going to say Manhattan College is also one, where, you know, we can have intelligent teach-ins with professors who know the history of both, right? Or understand the history, or are worried about our students, whether Jewish, Muslim, or others, being safe or unsafe. Freedom of speech is very important to me. It's part of why I live in this country, but I don't agree with the freedom of hate. And those are two very different, distinctive things. So I don't think it's fair to be on a campus and say, okay, Jews should not be on this campus, or they should be locked up, or they should be ostracized, and that Muslims shouldn't either. So these are the moments that we need to sort of think about this, because these are gifts that we have through our Constitution. The respect and pain of others, even if you don't respect the pain. But you need to acknowledge that someone else is suffering amidst you, and that suffering may not be yours. That is the hardest thing to do, guys. That's a challenging space. That's the brave space to be in. Be present for one another, even if you do not agree. But when you're present, and don't even have to say anything. I know that there are questions out there that want to ask, you know, do we have to be part of anything? No, but just be present, just be kind, just be gentle and listen deeply. That's a Buddhist trait. And since I teach religious studies, I get to know a lot about different traditions. And one of them is about deep listening. And the deep listening means just to be there present and say, I'm here for you. What is higher education about? Discussion, exploration, and debates. This is where we must continue our critical thinking. This is where we must continue our dialogue and our debates. My commitment to higher ed, my commitment to my students, my commitment to intellectual freedom is pretty much why I exist. Directing a center, creating programs for students, for community members is my commitment to humanity. But higher education really, it has to be a place of discussion, exploration, and debates. And you do have the freedom to protest, but not the freedom to hate. Cancel culture and social media are the most dangerous that we have today. I'll give you an example. My 16-year-old daughter was on TikTok, and she was on a bunch of Muslim TikToks because she joined them during Ramadan. And, you know, she likes to watch music or have a community on TikTok about what's going on in Ramadan and look at food in different places for iftar. And then she really got off TikTok because she felt like both, like even her interfaith friends and the Muslim TikToks were just too much for her to bear in terms of hate and cancel culture. And, you know, she did that for herself. And I'm really proud of her because she just didn't want to watch, you know, Arabs or Jews or Palestinians or Muslims or Israelis cancel each other out, because for her, they're equally human. That's how I've raised her. And as Muslims, that is what we are taught in the household. That is what we are taught from the Quran itself. So that's all I'm going to share right now, and I'll hand it over to Jonathan.
There we go. Thank you so much, Mehnaz. Thank you for all of that. And so I'm going to share a few slides as well. I'll just also add one thought that we did get some wonderful questions in advance, and both Mehnaz and I and Donald tried to kind of, you know, look into these, and some of them I've incorporated, you know, the best I can answer into this, you know, what I'm going to say right now as well. What is Islamophobia? It's an extreme fear and hostility towards Islam and Muslims, which leads to hate speech, hate crimes, as well as social and political discrimination. And I'll talk about some of these other, you know, things that evolve out of that. There was a question about, you know, how we define these terms. I'd say that we're kind of using them pretty much. We're talking about hate against Muslims and hate against Jews. There's obviously a very rich, you know, conversation about what Semite means and whatnot, but we're kind of using it in these very broad, you know, terms today. You know that Islamophobia to some extent was here from the very beginning. The very first Muslims that came to America, the very first Muslims that came to the US came as enslaved people from West Africa. And what was interesting about that was that they tended to, there was a greater likelihood that they were literate, that they spoke Arabic because they read and studied the Quran. This was a threat to their enslavers, right? That they thought that they could communicate in code with one another, that they could read, that they could write, and this posed a greater threat. And so there was a greater fear of those Muslim enslaved people. These are just a couple of examples of some of the individuals that we know. A guy named Ben Ali, a Ghanaian, who actually, along with other people, established what we think was maybe the very first masjid in the United States, which was something that was extremely rare at the time. People were not allowed to practice their faith. And then another kind of well-known individual Abdul Rahman Ibrahim Sori, who wrote 2 autobiographies, 2 copies of the Fatiha. And so anyway, there's a lot of wonderful information about this early phase. And I've got here 2 books to recommend. Sylviane Diouf's.
I thought we were done with sand. The sand has been all
Servants
put
of
away.
Allah, and this other one here that's about Sori in particular. So over the next couple of centuries or so, Muslims would continue to come to the United States, to immigrate to the United States, but at a relatively slow rate. We see here probably the first official mosque that was founded and maintained for some time was in Bidford, Maine. That would change with the 1965 Immigration Act, when many people from around the world, including many Muslims, would start to come to the United States in much larger numbers. So, and I want to say one other thing too as well. I'm going to share some images, right, that are representing hate against Muslims right now, and maybe Jews as well. So I just kind of trigger alert across the board here. Some of these images are, unfortunate. None of us like to see them, but this is what we're, here to study today. So, conventional wisdom has it that 9/11 was the major turning point, as you can see from this graph. Absolutely, that was a major spike and a major landmark in Americans' attitudes towards Muslims. But actually, I was on a great webinar that Council on Foreign Relations organized a few weeks ago, talking about Islamophobia. And many of the Muslim scholars there were actually going back and talking about the 1979, revolution in Iran, which had deep anti-American overtones as well. And so going all the way, back there to points in history where we could see the Islamophobia, but more importantly than any of the events that become before or after is the basic concept that anti-Muslim, anti-Arab ideas were ingrained in the American mind long before. We got 2 classic works here, Edward Said's Orientalism and Fatima Mernissy's number of works that she does about, sort of Western fantasies, about the harem, and all kinds of other Orientalist tropes that many Westerners have. A wonderful documentary by Jack Shaheen, Real Bad Arabs, where he, outlines the way that Muslims and Arabs have been depicted in film, in cinema, in cartoons as well. I grew up watching Looney Tunes, and I have to be very conscious of the fact that some of these images, like it or not, were embedded in my kind of deep hard drive as a little boy. How do I overcome those now as a conscious adult? The other thing very important to recognize the disconnect. Now, this is from a Pew Research survey. It goes back to 2011, but it's very telling in the fact that when they asked Muslims, do you see yourself as distinct or as part of, the fabric of America? Only 20% really said that they wanted to be distinct from the larger American fabric. But when they asked non-Muslim Americans what they thought Muslims thought, right? They were saying here that just 33% wanted to adopt American ways, and guessing that over 50% actually wanted to remain distinct. So this really, betrays a deep disconnect between the way Muslims like to see themselves as Americans and the way that other Americans see them. So now, how does all of this manifest? I want to first mention some of the institutional forms of discrimination that we see. Of course, immigration. And, I'll be honest, I was really on the fence about whether or not to include this image here of the former president talking about Islam. Of course, he implemented what is widely, commonly known as the Muslim ban. I hope that people that are, thinking about abandoning Joe Biden right now will remember what that was like and what that could be like in another term. But it also, there's this kind of conflation, right, of anti-immigration. As many of you know, I work very closely with refugees from around the world. And so, to see signs like this, say no to Syrian refugees, it's very alarming. other forms of institutional. So in law enforcement, two of my own colleagues from Drew University, actually, I don't know if they're here on the call, but Dr. Sanjay Mishra and Dean Ginny Lokanita did a study some years ago looking at LA, looking at, the LAPD and their attempts to reach out to the Muslim community, but at the same time, we're using some of those relationships to collect intelligence on the community, right? And so an utter betrayal of trust, which at the end of the day is really the most critical principle of all. How do you, build trust? Of course, other incidents of Muslims feeling that they were targeted or discriminated by law enforcement in the United States. In public schools, right? We've got all sorts of incidents, students being made to feel unwelcome, unsafe, discrimination against the hijab in a number of cases. Sorry for the shameless plug, but a book that I wrote, co-authored with a graduate student of mine, Joe McAllister, was just published, where we take a close look at this issue, right? What type of discrimination do we see in schools, be it in sports, be it in the classroom, be it with regard to prayer, be it with regard to religious garb that students want to wear, and so forth. And of course, controversies when in world history classes, people are trying to teach about Islam. Of course, discrimination we're all familiar with on airlines when it comes to national security and so forth, in civic and social life. And some of this is actually institutional as well, but the biases against mosques, these mosque controversies, and I've actually had a front row seat to several of them. When a dear friend pictured here, Dr. Ali Chaudhry in Basking Ridge, they established their masjid. There was great pushback, unfortunately, despite him having been elected mayor of the town just some years before. And we now have the construction of a mosque in Madison coming, and I actually attended some of those hearings as well, right? And I'll make this point at the very end, but absolutely everybody is absolutely allowed to practice their religion in the United States. And these movements to, and everyone, they complain about any other reason that they'll give for being against the mosque, but at the end of the day, they are trying to prevent people from practicing their faith in a safe space. Of course, the hate groups that are out there that are established, that are, distinctively and decidedly anti-Islam, of course, on social media. This is, just graph just showing the rise of anti-Islam, Islamophobic hashtags. And then to what extent is it sort of individual acts, right? So this reporting over 2,500 anti-Muslim bias incidents. And I highlight this one here. You see this guy, Stuart Seldowitz. This was like, everybody saw this video and it went viral a week or two ago of the man that was going around to halal carts in New York City, harassing people that he perceived to be Muslim or Arab, and just coming up to the cart and just, provoking them. But is that an individual act of just an individual person? What happens when it turns out that this person was in the Obama administration and several administrations, right? When he was a national defense advisor, when he actually was on the Bureau of Israeli-Palestinian Affairs, right? So to think that this person was such an important decision maker and influencer inside of our government, right? You have to kind of think, well, does that really count as an individual act when we see? So happening now. Right. And these are just a few incidents. I'm sure many of you are aware of them, but just in the past few weeks or so, alone, just days after October 7, we had this horrible killing of a young boy just outside of Chicago. That, people were aware perhaps of things that he was saying, that he was, scared of them or whatever it was, but he walked into the apartment and murdered the young man, and the woman, was stabbed as well. And he is, now being tried for hate crimes at Stanford University just the other day, over the weekend, or just before the weekend. An Arab Muslim student was hit by a vehicle. And again, the driver, was yelling obscenities out the window. So that, of course, is under investigation for being a hate crime as well. And then, of course, many of us were watching this unfold over the long Thanksgiving weekend, right? Where Tahsin Ali Ahmad, Kenan Abdul Hamid, and Hisham Awatani were shot at close range by a guy who just saw them walking down the street, got off his porch and shot them. And the third young man, Awatani, looks like he is going to be paralyzed from the spine down now as a result. The other men are recovering from their injuries. And you also wonder, like, why and how. I referenced my friend Ali Chaudhry a moment ago, and he said something very interesting to me the other day. Many of the attacks that happen on Jews or on Muslims, with Jews, it tends to be against men because of what they wear and how they wear their hair or so forth, may be very obvious to people, and so they become targets. With Muslims, it tends to be women because they're wearing, if they're wearing hijab, and so they're more likely to be targeted. And it's interesting to think, was the kafiyah was what, set this guy off or turned them into targets as well. So really unfortunate, just this picture of them, as these three young men have known each other since they're little boys. And it turns out that one of them is from the Tamimi family as well. So I'm talking with a friend in Palestine who knows the family. So what can be done? And I'll just quickly say a couple of things here. First of all, it is absolutely our constitutional right. If you look at not every one of the founders, but the founders who won the debate, right? This was a country that was supposed to be for Muslims, for Jews, for Christians, for anybody. They were using the language Mohammedan at the time, but this is what we mean by Muslim. Very, very important. Anybody that's saying this is a Christian nation, they're just not paying attention to what the founders of our nation had to say. Things that can be done today along the lines of what Mehnaz was talking about, right? So, this worst attack in Pittsburgh just a couple of years ago, well, Muslims raised $250,000 for the synagogue, right? When it was the attack in New Zealand, it was a Jewish community in Pittsburgh that rallied to help the community. Partnerships between mosques and synagogues, you had instances where, like in Texas, for instance, when it was a synagogue when it was a mosque that was attacked, the synagogue invited the Jews to worship there. Likewise, you have other instances where the synagogue has invited the Muslims to worship when it was their space that came under attack. Interfaith work, as Mehnaz says, there is, look in your county, look nationally, but look right in your own town. Many small towns have their own interfaith council, and they're doing stuff, and they would love to see more members show up. They're tired of seeing the same 10 people show up at their events. They want more people coming through their doors. I'll just mention, I'm proud to serve on the Interfaith Advisory Council of the Office of Homeland Security and Preparedness for New Jersey. We've hosted several of the meetings. This is an amazing, because anytime that something is going wrong, we hear this police department hired somebody to do training, and we're concerned about who they hired. We have a direct line to the people, right, who oversee some of that can reach out. We're a direct line that Muslims can call them, Jews can call them and say, we're not comfortable with what's going on there. It is a direct line of communication to the people that, are in power in many cases. It's very important to work. Other groups that are deliberately, there's this amazing group, Muslims Against Antisemitism. They're on social media. They're always putting stuff out there. I just discovered this graph, which I think is fascinating, asking different religious groups, if they think there's prejudice towards Muslims. And look at this. The highest group was Jews that feel that there is, even more so than Muslims, according to this one poll, right? So it's very, very important to have this type of empathy. I saw this headline in USA Today, and I got excited. Jewish and Muslim organizations denouncing attacks. Well, it turns out, unfortunately, that they were not working together. It was one very prominent, Muslim group complaining about the Islamophobic attacks, one very prominent Jewish group complaining about the anti-Jewish attacks, but they didn't seem to be expressing that much concern for the other. So this is like a vigil that was organized, in Vermont. Again, Jewish groups that spoke out against Islamophobia. And then this was just something I saw on Twitter the other day. It was happening just last night in Philadelphia, where pro-Palestinian marches were attacking a Jewish Israeli restaurant. It really had nothing to do with the conflict whatsoever. They just found a Jewish-owned business and were targeting it in a very threatening way. And so it was just interesting to see there were Muslims that were saying this is anti-Semitism, right? So call it out, show up when it's time to show up and when it's time to stand up. I'll come back to this, but we have our own institute that we run here at Drew University in the summer, and we would love to invite undergraduates from around the New York, New Jersey area. I'll share in a moment a link to the to the inquiry form, but this is something that we do. It's a week plus program where we invite all kinds of wonderful people like Donald Proby, and we're inviting Mehnaz this year, and all kinds of people who do this type of work to come train young leaders who are interested in doing this type of work, to give you the tools, to give you the skills, to give you the strategies to combat hatred, no matter where and how it manifests. And I will pause there. Thank you so much. I'm gonna take a breath.
So, I mean, I want to, I mean, we have some time for questions, but I also want to talk about some of the questions that came in earlier. And a lot of the questions are about, how can we educate ourselves? How can we have the facts? How can we have a resource that's not biased, right? Look, I teach religious studies. Can you imagine the bias that I find in text and how people interpret religion, right? So it's really an individual interpretation. What I say to my students, and I think some of them are on here, is that you have to ask yourself what it is that you want to claim or what you're looking for, right? For example, social media has an algorithm that when you see all of these anti-Semitic posts or, anti-Muslim posts, anti-Palestinian or anti-Israeli, there is something that you're looking at that is looking at you, right? So this is not it's not an independent sort of, wish of social media. I mean, AI could be that smart at some point, but at the same time, we are regurgitating what we don't want to see. That's number one. And that's the same thing with interpretation. If you don't have a critical mind, it's hard to take in information and to ask the right questions. And then I do at some point, Jonathan, I mean, if you want to do it, I can do it too, is talk about Zionism, because I think that's a very important topic. Years ago, I did a series on what is Zionism for Hadassah, Jewish women organization, because I felt that it was such a kind of understood word that is a historical word, right? And it stems from the 1870s all the way on in terms of different kinds of Zionism and what Zionism means to most Jews. And I have Jewish friends that say, I'm not a Zionist. So I want to be clear, because there's a lot of cartoons in, unfortunately, the Arab world, as well as in Iran, that depict Zionism as being equated to Nazism, Zionists being equated to Nazis. And that's very problematic for just for the non-Jews here, for them to kind of understand what that really does. And I think that is a word that a lot of my own Muslim community and friends don't understand. And when I give them the history of what it actually is, theologically, politically, culturally, and in a secular sense, they start to understand. When we kind of, don't understand these terms and give them valence with equating it to something like Nazis or Nazism, becomes really problematic historically, and also in terms of who we are today. Fascism was a very long-standing thing, and there were millions of people persecuted under different kinds of fascism. And it's only today that we're up to 14 to 15 million Jews since before the Holocaust. So you can imagine that sort of gap and that idea. So if we as non-Jews don't understand Jewish history, it's very hard for us to form an opinion. And it's very hard for us to form an opinion about Palestinians and who they are and what do they desire and what are their dreams and how do they vote. for Hamas, or how did they not vote for Hamas? And, perhaps they haven't had elections. There's a lot of questions that one needs to ask in terms of this. I also want to say that I did put out a statement for the Holocaust Genocide Interfaith Education Center. You're welcome to look at it. And we lost someone very dear to our center who was the grandson of Harman Ziering in Israel. His name was Aryeh Ziering, and he was in the K-9 unit for the IDF, and he was murdered. He's the grandson of Harman Ziering. Harman Ziering is the man who I built an exhibit around. I have an archive, an exhibit. We're finalizing the archive. And I know his family because I met Aryeh at his aunt's house. So these stories are very close to me. For me, losing an Israeli is the same as losing a Palestinian. And I think that we need to stop thinking about the destruction of each other that is really, really polarizing us in terms of our campuses, in terms of our country, in terms of people's businesses. Shooting 3 young men, Muslim men, wearing a kafifa is incredible. My students who wear hijab on campus, I'm also the Muslim student advisor, are constantly glared at or attacked when they take the one subway. And this has been going on for some time. My Jewish community in Riverdale, their windows are always broken. They have tons of security. This has gone on and on and on. We have stood together at the monument in Riverdale where I've spoken up against anti-Semitism. So this is not new, but it's intense, right? It's a very intensified war. It's a war that I don't control, that I don't have a solution for, I don't have a Band-Aid for. And we have to navigate our spaces peacefully because we don't have the answers. I don't have a direct line to Hamas, nor do I have a direct line to Netanyahu. So I want you to, I know that sounds really simplistic, but that's so important for you to understand as we talk about these issues. Because these issues are historical. We just try to show you that they have some historical life in this country. And we are in America, and we are Americans. Jonathan and I, Jewish and Muslim, are both American. And we want our freedom and our right to practice our religion. I still want to be able to do Ramadan. I still want to be able to wear a hijab if I want one day or not. I still want to be able to provide a space for my students to do their salat on campus. These are very important things in terms of spirituality and the allowance of that. So I just wanted to say a few things, Jonathan, and if you want to come in.
No, sure, I appreciate that. And just while I have it queued up, I'm putting that link to that institute that I mentioned in chat. I also invite people to, you are able, everybody, to, you can't chat with each other, but you can send messages to Donald or Mehnaz or myself or Henry if you have questions that you want to submit, and we're happy to stay on. We talked about, we're not going to shut at 8. We can go, a little past the hour so that we can take some questions. But yes, to your point, I think the most important thing that's missing in the conversations that are happening, and it's ironic, right? Because you think a college campus, an institution of higher ed, is where we're always trying to teach critical thinking. Stop, pause, what's the source of that information? Let's look up another counterpoint. But somehow what we're seeing is a kind of knee-jerk responses. You referenced, TikTok already, and that, it's like people see one video and they're ready to walk outside and march, 3 minutes later. Of course, the question of Zionism is so much more complicated than that. It's, to me, right, maybe people define it differently. It means that there's a Jewish homeland, right? And, if you look at the history of the Jewish people throughout time and across space, there really can't be much question that the Jewish people need a homeland. I know, people, when they're saying go back to Europe, well, that didn't really work out very well for Jews that were living in Europe in the mid-20th century. And it's amazing how quickly people are willing to, forget that. I recently published an article together. It was a lovely series on Jerusalem together with a colleague, Saliba Sarsar, where one volume was like Jewish perspectives on Jerusalem, one was on Muslim perspectives in Jerusalem, and one was on Christian perspectives. And I had written in the, the Jewish one, and it was very, deeply personal article about my own relationship with the region and whatnot. And what I said was, in a simple terms, I'm thrilled that in my lifetime there is a Jewish homeland. I'm deeply troubled that it has meant the dispossession and displacement of other people, and that it's led to, a century or more of conflict now. And I think we do need to, find peace. But when you hear people, first of all, as you suggested also, it is deeply offensive. There are so many, even if people want to indict, and criticize Israel, there are many other authoritarian regimes out there, if that's the comparison that you want to make, without going Nazi. The very people that literally tried to exterminate the Jewish people, right? It's like sort of deeply offensive that is the go-to in this criticism of Israel. Let's make sure we find the most offensive and quite honestly frightening. You mentioned being subjected to Islamophobia. I do a class with Donald, a Black Jewish dialogue, where one of the exercises we do is to share, what was your first encounter with it? Like, not you read about it, not you saw it, not you heard about it, you were taught about it, you literally lived it. And I remember, like it happened yesterday when I was maybe 5 or 6 years old, where a guy, attacking my mom, calling her a cheap old Jewish lady or something like that. And I remember the feeling that I had, the adrenaline that rushed through my body, the fear that I felt, the amygdala hijack for those of us, that work in the space, familiar with that term. I feel that way when I see a swastika. I'm like, you can criticize Israel without waving a swastika, right? Other language that I think is also kind of really sloppy. I mean, very simply throwing around the term colonizer, where anybody that knows their history will know that there have been Jews there since roughly 1000 BC and all the way through. Many of the Jews that did come in the early part of the 20th century, particularly mid-century, were Mizrahi Jews, Jews of Arab cultural descent, right, that were forced out of Tunisia and Morocco and Egypt and Persia and all these other countries where they had lived for centuries side by side, right? And they were sort of either forced out or scared out. So again, to also make it sound like it's just this big colonial project. So, my point here is not to speak in defense of Israel necessarily, but just to point out how deeply anti-Semitic it can very, very quickly become or be perceived. And I urge people, people that know me know that I've worked very hard for peace in the region for many, many years, for listening to all different sides. It's a lot more complicated than both sides, right? But that I urge everybody to just be really careful with the language that we're using, and not just because it's offensive, because there's that, right? I told you how I feel viscerally when I experience it, when I see it. But more than anything is that it actually inhibits the creation of a solution. We're talking in these ways that we're polarizing and pushing people further and further apart, and the possibilities for coming together around these conversations, whether it be on a college campus in the United States or whether it literally be over there. And of course, ever since October 7, I've been on the phone with friends with family in Gaza, people in the West Bank whose families are terrified, Israeli friends, of course, first, second degree with people with family with hostages that were killed and all of that, right? And the other thing that I'll tell you is that, we have to listen also to a lot of the people there that are living it. A lot of people here think they know better. We need to really listen to the voices there of the people that are living the conflict. And I see someone put in there, yes, so many sides. Thank you so much for that. So I'll pause there.
Yeah.
Thank you. And I just want to acknowledge that there was a question that was sent to me, and just wanting to put that out there for either of you if you would like to respond in some way. And it's a bit of a lengthy question, so you're going to have to listen pretty closely. And I can also put it into the main chat if you like as follow-up. But the question is, why are we conflating Zionism and anti-Semitism? as one factor. And then doesn't the creation of the state of Israel in 1948 and its existence depend on displacing and disempowering and forcing Palestinians out of their indigenous land? Whereas there's so much censorship around speaking up against the policies of Israel in conflation with anti-Semitism. There were always Jews living with equal rights. Muslims don't now live with those equal rights. So this particular participant has some very specific concerns about equity in the land, it sounds like.
Okay,
So,
yeah, I mean, there is another comment that came through. I mean, I want to say that the anti-Palestinian rhetoric is also terrible. I mean, this is not just about anti-Semitism. The anti-Arab rhetoric is terrible. The bombing of thousands of civilians is awful. I condemn it. I think that we're not here to say that we're okay with the violence, whether it's by Hamas, whether it's by Israel. And I think it is unequal. Look, I'm originally from Pakistan, and my country was created in 1947, a year before Israel. And we were also colonized by the British, and we were split up. And my grandparents were immigrants that lost everything in different parts of India. A lot of 1.2 million people were murdered during the partition. People were displaced. They lost their homes. They lost everything. And we still have guns on the border with India and Pakistan. Not very proud of that, right? But what my point is that colonial settlers are we are. The United States is also a colonial settler country. And I think that we have to acknowledge that we can't say this is a new formation. In the 1940s, there were lots of new nation states created post-colonialism. Israel was seen as a colonial state because of its recognition by the United States and the UN. But I also say that it was a perception that the Palestinians had on the ground in Israel because they were seen as Europeans, because you know what? They were Europeans, a lot of them, but a lot of them were coming from Arab lands. So one of the things that we have to also understand is the perception. Did the Palestinians know about the Holocaust? Not really. Maybe some pockets did when the Mufti was around. But did all of them know about it? No, they had no idea that they were running away from persecution. It seemed like, and it was like, colonization in terms of their interpretation. So I think that's a really important point. And there's a lot of material if you want to read something like that to think about. I mean, I talk about in my book, Shoah Through Muslim Eyes. I talk about this one moment in time in history, how, Jews who came to Palestine and Palestinians that saw the Jews and the violence that ensued. That's a whole different story. But that perception, that moment is pivotal in understanding that moment of colonization as well as persecution, right? Running away from persecution, building something, wanting to build something from 1870s, right? Don't forget the pogroms in Russia, and don't forget Herzl was secular and he came up with the word Zion. And Zionism, anti-Zionism can be anti-Semitic, and this is another question that is part of it, because Zion is the home for Jews. It's not, you could say anti-Zionism is like anti-Israel. You can definitely, and I do it, is criticize Israel as a government, as a policymaker, its leaders. That is not anti-Semitic. Please, that is so clear in many of the definitions of anti-Semitism. As a matter of fact, most Jews were criticizing Israel and were demonstrating against Israel before October 7th, right? Because they have that freedom as well, and they have that right. I criticize the United States or the Pakistani government or the Middle East. That is your right. But to say, I don't want India to exist, I think that's genocidal itself. So I think that there are ways to talk about this with compassion, but there are also ways to understand that there's a history of Judaism that most people don't know, and a history of the Palestinian and the Arab people. I also want to mention one more thing that has been very frustrating for me doing this work, is that we have, the Uyghur genocide that is going on in China, and I don't see any Muslims standing up for them. And we have the Rohingya genocide going on in Myanmar. I don't see Muslims standing up for them. And we have horrible human rights abuses against Muslims in India, and I don't see anyone standing up for them. So, that to me, I teach genocide is very important, that if every Muslim life should be equal, every Jewish life should be equal. But I'm not experiencing that. That somehow Asian and African lives are less important. And to me, that is un-Islamic, because Prophet Muhammad was very clear that we should not differentiate between an Arab and a non-Arab, the last sermon that he gave. And so I think we really need to think about this deeply and hard and ask ourselves, why are we all indeed so anti-Semitic? It's everywhere. I've written about it, I've experienced it. But there are Muslims that are willing to talk about this, and there are Muslims that you can join, and also Jews that are willing to be self-critical about their community. And I think that's what we need more of.
Thanks so much. Very well said. I mean, I'll just very little to add, but simply to say that I agree 100%. I mean, that criticism of Israel, as you said, I've been very critical of certain leaders in the recent history of Israel. There's two things. There's two reasons why it gets so complicated, if you ask me. One is that you genuinely do have anti-Semites who bandwagon onto it, right? I mean, right now, David Duke is out there like screaming for the liberation of Palestine, like America's most famous neo-Nazi, right? KKK guy is, there's a guy, Josh Hinkle, who's a major influencer on, on Twitter, on X, who is just a white supremacist. He's essentially also a neo-Nazi, and is suddenly this great voice for Palestinian liberation. So I feel that you do get genuine anti-Semites who kind of sneak in, wedge in on the Palestine issue. And secondly, it's just something that I've run into, complications myself, where I just simply try to hold the line where I'm saying to a student or whomever, yes, it's absolutely legitimate to criticize Israel, to criticize the Israeli government, to criticize policies and actions that they take, but just be careful with your language, right? Because you might be posting something which seems to be, really supporting like Hamas, or really supporting something else which is anti-Semitic. Just, when you're in such fraught territory, the extra caution with the language that we use. I mean, I already referred a moment ago to the, that we're seeing. I mean, it's just sickening that I have to see swastikas flying around in places in New York City where I've spent my whole life, in Times Square, wherever it is, where I go, Central Park, my hometown essentially of New York City, and I'm seeing Nazi like flags and swastikas on signs in Rockefeller Center. That's really, really disturbing to me. There's a much better way to communicate your frustration over Israel generally, or even specifically this war. And so I just ask people to, take your time, everybody slow down, everybody fact check what you're reading, fact check what you're posting. I think this is a really important piece of it. And then the other thing that I'll just say is that, a lot of us like to talk about how we're, it's this zero-sum approach, right, that we seem to be caught up in, which is that hope you understand, one of the major reasons that we decided to model this dialogue today, where I would talk about, I think, as you can see, I'm very passionate about anti-Semitism as well, but we made this point to say I'm equally passionate about Islamophobia, just as Mehnaz is about anti-Semitism, because it's the principle of it. We don't practice selective empathy. I know my students and others that are here that have heard me, I know I say it so often, they're going to put it on my tombstone. I hope they do. But the phrasing from the Rabbi Hillel, the elder, who said, if I am not for myself, who will be for me? Very important. We all have to stand up for ourselves. But if I am only for myself, what am I? What am I if the only thing that agitates me is anti-Semitism and not all the other hatred and prejudice that we see out there? And so but I say today, sadly, so the zero-sum game is like, some of you may be sitting here now thinking, how dare he express all of this empathy for, Islam when we're seeing the greatest amount of anti-Semitism we've ever seen in this country. I don't have to give up a single iota of my passion and concern for anti-Semitism to express massive empathy and compassion for Muslims who are suffering in the current environment as well. It cost me zero. I didn't have to give up a slice of my pie. I didn't have to give up any change in my pocket. And sadly, though, I think that we're actually now in what I call a less than zero-sum game, where people are not only refusing to acknowledge, but actively denying the suffering of others. The things that we're seeing, people, oh, their numbers are inflated. Oh, this didn't really happen, right? I mean, I think that that is also something that we really need to address. And to bring it all the way back to the question about Israel, Palestine, once we stop, right? I mean, with all of that, with this one side has to be right, no matter, never admit wrongdoing on your side or on the other side or whatever it may be, we're never going to get anywhere, right? People need to be able to come together, have really authentic and honest dialogue. We've seen, right, in '93 in Oslo, they came close, and we can come close again. There are some really fresh ideas out there. I've got a final slide with like land for people. There's a few interesting new initiatives that are out there. There are wonderful people in the region. I know another former student of mine, Melanie, is here, who has been deeply involved in Israeli-Palestinian peace building. There are wonderful organizations out there, the Parent Circle, where they're bringing the bereaved families. You think that you can't talk to an Israeli, or you think that you can't talk to a Palestinian, but you have people whose children were killed by people on the other side that are hugging each other and best friends with one another. And if they can do that, we can do that. And indeed, it's the only thing that's ever going to get us to a place where we can really have a genuine conversation about peace.
Can I just make one small point, and I think we should wrap it up, is this violence, or that we're experiencing, like the shooting of Muslims, or the killing of the boy. I mean, all of this violence, what I'm trying to say, is not coming from Muslims and Jews. This is the whole point of the historical lesson. They're coming from non-Muslims and non-Jews, but directed towards Muslims and Jews, right? We have to keep that in mind and understand that. That a lot of this in this country, which is what we're talking about here in the United States, a lot of these protests, it's not all Jews and Muslims. I mean, there are a lot of other people in these protests, right? With a lot of different kind of leanings, and it may not be for Palestinians or for Israel. So, the reason it's an explosive war for the United States is an ally, but also because there are other issues that surround the problem. And I remember years ago, saying to someone in my family that Israel and Palestine is the 21st century problem, because it's about nation, it's about race, it's about religion, it's about space, it's about so many things all into one complex ball. But the best thing we can do here in the United States is be there for one another if we want to have dialogues. And someone asked about best practices, Jonathan, and if you can just jump in and do that. And we are doing that best practice right now as best as we can. I know I haven't gone to everyone's question and not everybody's happy with me, but that's fine. That's part of what we're doing, is why we're having this dialogue. And when I see comments that you should say this, or you should say that, or you should condemn that, that is when you've stopped listening. Because you want to have your word out there, and that's when we're not listening, right? And that's part of best practices, When, you know, a Palestinian student of mine is hurt and is bereaved and is crying, you listen, you're there. Of course it's painful, right? Or a friend of ours whose house was blown up in Gaza. Or, you know, like I was talking about REA that I knew. So, I mean, these are very important moments that we can really be there for one another rather than, oh, you didn't say that this was a problem, or you didn't say this about antisemitism or Islamophobia, or whatever it is that people have on their agenda. So if you're going to have a conversation, try to come with an open mind. That's one way. Two, know people have their, talk to people who have historical knowledge on many different sides, right? Historians, religious studies people, sociologists, anthropologists. I mean, we are trained in this. We teach this stuff. So I think that campus leadership definitely has a problem because they don't know how to quell this. Two, I think campus leadership is not listening. And three, campus leadership is supposed to monitor and advise and mentor your students. And when your student comes to you and says, I want to have a protest, you need to say, okay, what about? What's the goal? What's the end goal of this? And then you can work with them. So I think these are important things to think about as we move forward, hopefully into a better and safer climate for actually our children and our students that are our future. Thank you.
They absolutely are our future. Final words, Jonathan, and then we'll start to close.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. I mean, I again agree wholeheartedly with Mehnaz. I mean, you know, a term that she used earlier, we talk a lot about safe space, and it's really, really important that we help our students and just community members feel safe. But it's also important that we're willing to enter into a brave space, right? And you know, the courage of Mehnaz, for instance, to, you know, to sit here this evening and have this conversation. As she just said, people may not be happy with her. Maybe there are some people that aren't happy with me. But you know what? I'll be honest, it takes a lot more courage to talk to somebody with whom you disagree than it does to just post something on you know, wherever it is that you're posting, to shut down, to scream, to shout. Having these conversations is so important. And I do think that at college campuses, it's so important. We've, you know, it like, you see the way that the humanities, for instance, have come under attack the last few years. And we're always like, the way that we defend the humanities and the social sciences, we teach critical thinking. We teach critical thinking when it is more important than ever that we teach critical thinking, right? And that we like insist on it and that we enact it and implement it. Now is when we're not seeing it on our college campuses, right? People could, again, take a deep breath, take a step back, listen to someone with whom you disagree. And I think Mehnaz said it really, really well, that we need to be able to hold, you know, these different truths. We need to just hold up people, even if we, or especially if we disagree with them. So, you know, that's basically my final word. I mean, I'll just share very, very quickly, because I can share some other resources with folks. I don't know that I have this. Oh, so I did mention a workshop. I put that in the chat, a link to it. We're doing a workshop called Facilitating Complex Conversations next week on December 12th. Where basically it is a workshop to help. I know there's a lot of educators on here, some people that got in touch ahead of time, just to help give you some of the tools and the skills, like, because I know a lot of you want to have these conversations, and not just for educators. I know some of you are involved in your synagogues, your churches, your mosques, and you want to, we want to have the conversation, but we're not sure we know how. So that's something that we can share with you. Obviously, Mehnaz is doing tremendous work at Manhattan College and her center there. We're trying our hardest at our center. We've got wonderful people like Donald Proby teaching for us, David Thaler teaching for us, trying to teach people just how to have better conversations around these really difficult issues. So I thank you all so much for coming and really investing in this space and committing to the ideas that we're trying to put out there today.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. as we take the next couple of minutes just to close, just thematically, some of the things that have really been crucial that have come up during this conversation, and I just so appreciate the two of you in modeling what it means, what it looks like, what it feels like to dive into complexity and nuance, because that gets lost in the sound bites, it gets lost in the media, and it certainly gets lost on social media. So just being able to hold the complexity, holding ambiguity, being committed to deep learning, to deep listening, to nonviolent communication, in addition to what we say, how we say it, is so crucial in being able to engage these conversations. The active listening that's involved, what does that feel like? What does that look like? So as you go back into your routines, whatever it is that you do in the evening, I don't know, but what we do after the webinar, what we do after the workshop is crucial. So this was the opportunity to explore a variety of different things. And what we're asking you is to think deeply about your takeaways as participants. What actions are you prepared to take? And how will you ensure that you follow through? What is your level of accountability to yourself? So we're asking you just to take a moment to make a note for yourself or make a calendar entry, whatever is optimum for you. But don't let this be lost. Don't let this be another one of those things. It's like, oh yeah, you tell your friends and family, it was interesting, the got together. Please put this into action so that you can feel the benefit of what it's like to actually digest all of this. Is truly meaningful to you in your day-to-day living. So the recording will be made available to you, and we ask you to please share this with your families, within your communities, within your networks, and connect with us. We posted the information in the chat for you to be able to reach out to us. Please don't hesitate to do so. We are in this because this is what we believe in, this is what we love, and we want to see you to be as beautifully supported as possible. So thank you, Dr. Afridi. Thank you, Dr. Golden. Thanks to all of you for joining us and for your continued commitment to building peace in your day-to-day practices where it counts, where we live. Thanks, everybody. Good night.
Amen. Thank you. And as we enter this darkest time of year, spread the light if you can.
Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.